Officers humiliate a veteran in a diner, but then they see it on his desk. It was a brisk morning in the small town of Maplewood, where life moved slowly, and everyone knew each other by name. In the heart of this sleepy place stood a modest diner with creaky wooden floors and the comforting scent of coffee and bacon. Locals often gathered for breakfast, reading the paper or exchanging stories about weather forecasts. At a corner table, Raymond Cooper, a 72-year-old retired Army veteran, sat sipping his black coffee. He wore a threadbare jacket and faded jeans, nothing flashy. On the table in front of him, he'd placed a small notepad alongside a black pen. Raymond was a man who liked to jot down passing thoughts or errands. Despite his quiet demeanor, he had a warmth about him. That morning, nobody noticed two new figures entering the diner. Officers Harris and Locke from the Maplewood Police Department. Both had recently transferred from another city, sporting crisp uniforms and an air of authority that some might call overbearing. They stood at the door for a moment, scanning the place. Their eyes caught Raymond sitting alone, stirring coffee with a calm, steady hand. Harris nudged Locke. "What's that old guy doing here so early, scribbling in a notepad?" he remarked under his breath. Locke shrugged, but there was a trace of a smirk at the corners of his mouth. Together they approached the counter, ignoring the friendly greeting of Nora, the diner's waitress. After ordering black coffee for themselves, the officers carried their mugs to a booth near Raymond's table. They sat with a practiced air of confidence, eyes flicking to the older man as though he might cause trouble. At first they said nothing, content to watch him. He simply sipped his coffee and occasionally jotted a note in his pad. Eventually, Harris leaned over. "Morning," he called out, but his tone lacked any warmth. "Looks like you're busy, old-timer." Raymond turned, offering a polite nod. "Good morning, officer," he replied quietly, setting down his pen. He gave them a small smile, kind but reserved. Locke eyed the battered jacket, the worn shoes, and the wrinkled notepad. "Haven't seen you around," he said, his voice tinged with suspicion. "You live here?" Raymond hesitated, taking a moment to measure his words. "I've lived in Maplewood for about a decade," he said, his voice calm. "Retired here." Harris frowned. "Retired, huh? Mind if we ask from what line of work?" There was no reason for them to interrogate him, yet the question hung in the air. Raymond paused. He had never liked boasting about his military service. He saw it as his duty, not something for bragging rights. "Army," he answered simply, meeting Harris's gaze. "A while back." The officers exchanged quick glances. Something about Raymond, his quietness, his unassuming presence, seemed to irritate them. Maybe they expected more subservience, or maybe they disliked that he answered with such composure. "Army," Locke repeated. He let out a short laugh as if unimpressed. "Sure doesn't look like you had a big pension." His eyes flicked to Raymond's scuffed shoes and second-hand jacket. Raymond didn't flinch. "I get by," he said politely. But Harris pressed on. "Sometimes we see folks pretending to be veterans, fishing for discounts or respect," he said. "Any chance you're one of those guys?" A hush fell among the nearby patrons. People began to notice the tension. Nora, wiping counters, cast a nervous glance at Raymond, silently hoping everything would be okay. She knew him to be a gentle soul who never caused trouble. Raymond's jaw tightened slightly. He had faced disrespect before, but it never got easier. "I don't pretend anything," he replied softly. "I served, that's all." Locke scoffed. "If you served, where's your proof?" He gestured dismissively. "We got a lot of phonies around these parts. Stolen valor is no joke." Raymond said nothing at first, letting their insinuations hang. Then he reached for his wallet, flipping it open to reveal a small card, his VA identification, dog-eared and well-used. He slid it gently across the table towards the officers. Locke picked it up, peering at it with a skeptical glare. Harris leaned over his shoulder. They exchanged a glance, uncertain whether to accept it as genuine. Harris flicked it back, letting it land roughly on Raymond's table. "Looks fake," he muttered dismissively. Nearby diners glanced over, some with pity in their eyes, others simply curious. Yet no one intervened. Maplewood was small, and few wanted to cross the police. The officers were new, but they wore badges that gave them an intimidating edge. Raymond's composure remained intact, but an undercurrent of hurt flickered in his eyes. "I have no need to lie," he said quietly, tucking the ID away. Locke chuckled, taking a sip of coffee. "Well, maybe you're one of those vets who got themselves discharged dishonorably," he suggested. "Could explain a lot." That remark stung. Raymond inhaled slowly, deciding not to dignify it with a defense. He simply shook his head, but his silence egged them on. Harris sneered. "You know, wearing that jacket, pretending you served with honor. People like you make me sick." He pointed to the notepad on Raymond's table. "Writing a sob story? Maybe scamming folks for donations." Raymond met his gaze, shoulders squared. "I'm just jotting things down for my day," he said. "No scams here." Locke crossed his arms. "Why don't you leave?" "This place doesn't need your type lurking around, making customers uncomfortable." Raymond stiffened. "I'm not bothering anyone. I have the right to have coffee where I please." Harris stood towering over him. A hush fell across the diner. "You better watch your tone," he growled. "We can toss you out of here for being a nuisance." Raymond glanced at the other patrons. No one looked ready to stand up for him. He'd half a mind to walk out rather than endure further humiliation, but something in him rebelled at the idea of surrendering to their bullying. He had served his country, after all. He wouldn't be intimidated into hiding. The tension spiked as Harris reached out, yanking at the front of Raymond's jacket. "Let's see if you're packing anything suspicious," he muttered. Raymond's heart pounded, but he didn't resist as Harris patted him down. "Nothing but old bones," Locke joked cruelly. "Figures." Suddenly, the diner bell jingled as the front door opened. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform stepped inside. Captain Braxton of the Maplewood Police Department, recognized by most locals. The crowd parted as he scanned the room. He caught sight of Officers Harris and Locke harassing an older man, Raymond Cooper. Braxton's eyes narrowed. He strode over, his voice resonating with authority. "What's going on here?" Harris froze, still clutching Raymond's jacket. Locke quickly dropped his smug posture. "Sir, we were just, investigating a suspicious individual," Harris stammered. Braxton's gaze flicked to Raymond, who stood tall despite the assault on his dignity. "Suspicious?" the captain echoed, suspicion in his own tone. He recognized Raymond. How could he not? Maplewood was small enough that certain stories were well known. Locke tried to speak. "He claims to be a veteran, sir," he said, his voice faltering. "But we're not convinced. He's out of place. Might be a phony." Braxton silenced him with a sharp stare. Then he turned to the table where Raymond's notepad lay. Braxton noticed something else. A small plaque, half hidden under the notepad, resting on the table's edge. Intrigued, he reached over and picked it up. It was a service plaque, old but polished, reading, "Raymond Cooper, Staff Sergeant, Purple Heart recipient." Braxton's face changed instantly as he recognized what it meant. He turned the plaque in his hands, reading the inscription about gallantry in Vietnam decades ago. It was more than proof. It was a symbol of Raymond's sacrifices. Harris and Locke exchanged panicked glances. They realized too late that the thing on his desk, a seemingly innocuous plaque, was far from trivial. Captain Braxton set the plaque down carefully, then turned to Raymond. "Sergeant Cooper," he said, his voice thick with respect, "I'm sorry to see you being treated like this." Harris stammered, "Captain, we didn't know." Braxton's voice hardened. "But you made no effort to find out, did you? Instead, you presumed guilt." He turned to Raymond. "I sincerely apologize on behalf of this department. I recognize your service. We owe you better." Raymond lowered his gaze, a mix of relief and lingering anger swirling inside of him. "I appreciate that, Captain," he said softly. "I only came here for coffee." A tense silence followed, broken only by Nora's hushed words to a co-worker. The other diners watched with quiet satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, had arrived at last. Captain Braxton eyed his subordinates sternly. "Officers, step outside, now." Harris released Raymond and stepped back, swallowing hard. Locke placed his coffee on the table, his face drained of color. Together they shuffled out as the captain followed them, leaving Raymond standing alone. For a moment the diner was utterly still. Then a smattering of applause arose, soft at first, then growing. A middle-aged man at a nearby booth stood up. "Sorry we didn't step in sooner, sir," he said, his voice regretful. "Thank you for your service." Raymond bowed his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you," he murmured. "I understand. Sometimes speaking up is hard." Nora, the waitress, quickly approached, offering fresh coffee on the house. Her eyes glistened. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "You deserve more respect than that." Raymond forced a small, polite smile. "I've faced worse," he said, sipping the new coffee. Still, his hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. He stared at his plaque, remembering the sacrifices behind its metal edges. He never boasted about his Purple Heart. Painful memories lay behind it. But at this moment, it was a shield protecting his dignity from unwarranted scorn. Outside, muffled shouting indicated a heated confrontation between Braxton and the two officers. The diner patrons exchanged glances, anticipating the consequences. Eventually, Captain Braxton returned alone, his expression grim. He approached Raymond. "Mr. Cooper," he said quietly, "I've addressed this incident, and I assure you those two will face disciplinary measures. Again, my sincerest apologies." Raymond accepted the apology. "I appreciate it, Captain," he said. "I never wanted a scene." Braxton nodded. "I know. You've always been a humble man." He placed a gentle hand on Raymond's shoulder. "If you need anything, please let us know." With that, he departed, leaving Raymond to his once peaceful corner. Gradually, the diner's normal chatter resumed. A few folks approached Raymond, extending hands in gratitude for his service. He nodded politely, though he preferred not to dwell on the attention. He just wanted his quiet morning coffee. As he gathered his belongings to leave, Nora stepped forward. "Please stay and finish your breakfast, on the house," she insisted. "We insist, Mr. Cooper." He patted her hand gently. "Thank you, but I have errands to run." He slipped on his jacket, tucking the plaque under his arm. Glancing around, he saw empathy in many faces. The hostility from earlier had dissolved, replaced by a collective sense that an injustice had been righted. Stepping outside, Raymond inhaled the crisp air, a weight lifted from his shoulders. He recalled how, once again, his quiet dignity had prevailed, even as two uniformed officers tried to belittle him. One fleeting look at that plaque on his desk had changed everything. As he walked along Maplewood's Main Street, he thought about those officers. They might have authority, but they lacked humility. He hoped they'd learn something from this encounter, about respect, about service, about not making snap judgments. In the end, Raymond realized life would keep testing him. But after all he'd been through, he no longer feared the tests. He had survived battlefields, heartbreak, and the harshness of the world. A diner's scuffle with arrogant officers was but a small bump along his road. He headed home, his mind already turning back to peaceful thoughts and the satisfaction of having stood his ground.